Microphone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2015. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's November 20th. On this day in 1962, U.S. President John Kennedy declared the Cuban Missile Crisis at an end. But the real history of those days is quite different from the mythology that most Americans believe. When Nikita Khrushchev took control of Russia in 1953 after Stalin's death, he recognized that the USSR could not compete militarily with the U.S., the richest and most powerful country in history, in spite of American Cold War propaganda. If Russia ever hoped to escape its economic backwardness and the devastating effect of World War II, it would need to reverse the arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Accordingly, Khrushchev proposed sharp mutual reductions in offensive weapons. The incoming Kennedy administration, which had gotten elected by lying about Russia's powers, the so-called missile gap, the Kennedy people got themselves elected by saying Russia was ahead of the U.S. in intercontinental missiles, and only a vigorous response, in the word of the day, could handle that. The Kennedy administration, in fact, considered Khrushchev's argument for de-escalation and disarmament and immediately rejected it, instead turning to rapid military expansion, even though it was already far in the lead. The Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence, and the U.S. did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. U.S. intelligence verified that huge cuts had indeed been made in active Soviet military forces, both in terms of aircraft and manpower. In 1963, Khrushchev again called for new reductions. As a gesture, he withdrew troops from East Germany and called on Washington to reciprocate. But the Kennedy administration didn't. The Soviet reaction to the U.S. buildup of those years was to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962 to try to redress the balance at least slightly. The move was also motivated in part by Kennedy's terrorist campaign against Fidel Castro's Cuba, which was an embarrassment in the Western Hemisphere, and that campaign, what the Kennedy administration was scheduling, was an invasion for October 1962, as Russia and Cuba may well have known. We know later, many years ago, that this is what the Kennedy administration was going to do, and instead the Russian missiles were placed in Cuba. The ensuing missile crisis was, quote, the most dangerous moment in history, in the words of historian Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's advisor and confidant. As the crisis peaked in late October, Kennedy received a secret letter from Khrushchev offering to end it by simultaneous public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The latter were obsolete missiles already ordered withdrawn by the Kennedy administration because they were being replaced by far more lethal Polaris submarines to be stationed in the Mediterranean. Kennedy's subjective estimate at that moment was that if he refused the Soviet premier's offer, there was a 33% to 50% probability of nuclear war, a war that, as President Eisenhower had warned, would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere. Kennedy nonetheless refused Khrushchev's proposal for public withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba and Turkey, Only the withdrawal from Cuba could be public, said Kennedy, so as to protect the U.S. right to place missiles on Russia's borders or anywhere else it chose. And that is a tradition that lasts to this day. It's hard to think of a more horrendous decision in history than Kennedy's decision not to accept the de-escalation proposal by Khrushchev. And for this, he is still highly praised for his cool courage and statesmanship. New books on the subject appear practically every month. Soviet leader Khrushchev's good sense saved the world from John Kennedy's willingness to have a nuclear war. I've been reading media accounts of U.S. government war-making practically since those days, and my principal conclusion is that of the great reporter I.F. Stone, whom I'm proud to say that I knew lately. All governments lie. The Kennedy administration certainly did, and the Obama administration certainly does. For an account of current U.S. government lies, particularly about the killing they're doing around the world, see the Aware table at the Lincoln Square Holiday Market this weekend. You're watching News from Neptune, and All Governments Lie edition, and we will begin with Ron Soap.
Yes, I think I'm going to have two themes today, but just some scattershot first. Maybe we can get around to discussing the sit-ins, the agitation on the university campus down the street, the messed up university, as it's called. And
MU?
Right, MUU, messed up university, as it has been called by a high official figure. And the significance of the Princeton sit-in, which I think is kind of strange, wanting to erase all of the traces of Woodrow Wilson on the campus there, including the Wilson Center for International Studies, apparently. So this raises a broader question with me, retroactive judgments on long-dead figures of history, Columbus, Andrew Jackson, Adolf Hitler, and so on. I think all of these things become more problematic as those figures retreat into the past.
Do we need a revisionist perspective on Adolf Hitler?
Some people have offered one, but
Maybe on his
no.
childhood, on his babyhood. Right?
Yeah, right.
Well, there was this debate apparently going on in right-wing circles a few days ago about who would have killed the baby Hitler.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
But anyway, Jonathan Pollard was released today from a federal prison, and that had been announced actually a couple of months ago. He was a spy for Israel, sending them secret information as a Navy analyst with access to such information. It was long officially and loudly denied by the state of Israel that Pollard was an Israeli spy, but then they finally got around to admitting it and then demanding that he be released. And apparently his release was part of a package that was offered to Israel in exchange for submitting or acquiescing in the Iraq atomic arms agreement, Iranian agreement. Yeah. So today I didn't have time to read it. Interesting piece about an Israeli lawyer who's attempting to expose the secret arms sales by Israel to various human rights abusers, especially Burma and so on, and the refusal of the Israeli government to acknowledge any such thing. So there's a lot going on, but the big topic of the week, of course, is the massacre in Paris, and the subsequent reaction here. Should we offer sanctuary to a lot of refugees from Syria because of the fear that among them might be some people who are potential terrorists? And it's kind of odd that they should make such a point of this. There's an extensive vetting procedure in place for these people, as a number of other people keep pointing out. But anyway, this seems to make no impression. And of course, the most effective way of conducting political propaganda is the appeal to fear, the horrible, horrible, terrible things that might happen if you don't treat these people, denounce them and treat them in a certain way. So I will just juxtapose to that this study carried out recently. Headline, Tally counters perceptions of top terror threat in U.S. by Scott Shane in the New York Times going back apparently to June. Since September 11th, 2001, nearly twice as many people have been killed on American soil by white supremacists, anti-government fanatics, and other non-Muslim extremists than by radical Muslims, according to a count by a research group in Washington. Despite public anxiety about extremists inspired by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and this, of course, long precedes Paris, the number of violent plots by such individuals has remained very low. In contrast, right-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks per year in the decade after 9/11, causing a total of 254 fatalities, according to a study by Ari Perliger, a professor at the United States Military Academy, their Combating Terrorism Center. The toll has increased since the study was released in 2012. So these people seem to have a perspective. Those who want to keep out the Syrian refugees seem to have a somewhat inadequate view of what's going on. So there's all this hysteria about people wanting to come and take away our freedom. They hate us because of our freedom and so on. So since everybody is so much into symbolism, my symbolism of the day is the handcuffs that some people wanting to put on other people concerning what they can think and say on the campus, how they can dress, and so on. It's become pretty extreme and, in my view, wildly exaggerated, but maybe we can get some discussion about that. So I'll stop on that point.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll go to David Green for comments on Ron's animate versions.
Well, I don't follow the mainstream media in relation to the Paris bombings, although it should be noted that there was a bombing in Beirut, Lebanon, the day before, or 2 days before perhaps, the Paris bombings, which, if it had not been for the Paris bombings, would have come and gone with a very different tone in terms of the way it was treated by the mainstream media, because after all, it was mostly Muslims who were killed in the Beirut bombing. So I was a little shocked at the manner in which the mainstream media so blatantly treated these differently, given that there was, there was about 30 killed in Lebanon and well over 100 in Paris. It didn't seem to me that there could be such a blatant disregard, a blatant double standard, and that certainly has been pointed out. And there's been a little bit of drawback from that, but still, it's clear, that somebody's calling it the White Lives Matter movement in terms of the way Paris was treated versus the way Lebanon was treated. I don't get my news from the mainstream media. I get my news filtered, my mainstream media news filtered through the alternative media, because I can't stand to be, first of all, I'm not so fascinated by the details of these horrible things. There's plenty of horrible things going on. The question is, how do we understand these things, and how do we place them in historical context? Those are the only questions that I think really matter to me. Not that the people more immediately involved would be concerned with the who, what, when, where, why of all this. and of ISIS's activities in general. So the Pollard issue, again, the mainstream media focuses in on that without one thing to be said about the Pollard case is that it's one example of a case where the Israel lobby did not get its way. There was enormous pressure from influential people associated with the Israel lobby in this country to get Pollard released well before his 30-year sentence was due, and it didn't happen for reasons that explain a lot about what power the Israel lobby has and what it doesn't have. Ron, you referred to Iran. You referred to Iran, or you referred to the Israel arms trade, and with all the hubbub about Israel's opposition to the nuclear deal with Iran, don't forget that Israel was supplying Iran with arms in the 1980s, after the Shah fell, when it was being ruled by the Ayatollah during the Iran-Iraq war. Israel has shamelessly supplied arms, acted as a conduit of U.S. interests in the supplying of arms around the world, including Central America during the 1980s, including Southern Africa in the South Africa's wars against Angola in the 1980s. So whichever way you want to contextualize these things historically, the story in the media is never going to tell us much except to sort of get us involved in this frenetic sort of focused and sort of imagistic understanding of what's going on in the world.
Shouldn't we say that the Israel lobby eventually did get its way because the original sentence was for life?
Well, perhaps there was a compromise there over time, but it's just, it's not a major point. It just goes to show to those who claim that the Israel lobby is governing American foreign policy. There's plenty of exceptions to that, and for good reason.
That's a very important point, I think, because in fact it is a bit of mythology on both the right and the left in American politics that American governments give in too much to Israel. American policy is run for Israeli interests rather than American interests, it's sometimes said. The classic source of this is the book a decade ago by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, entitled The Israel Lobby, that has a lot of important information about how the Israel lobby works in this country, but unfortunately it feeds that notion that the American government policies are being run not for, quote, American interests, close quote, which raise a fair amount of questions in and of itself, but for Israeli interests. And it's worthwhile to point out the Pollard affair as a counterexample. Now, I think why that the lobby eventually gets its way after all these years, as you say, Ron, has much more to do with the Iran deal and with the U.S. Trying to square its allies in the Mideast who belong to the so-called Sunni alliance, that is Saudi Arabia and Israel, with the reincorporation of Iran into America's overall framework of order, in Henry Kissinger's view, in Henry Kissinger's words, for the Persian Gulf region. The real issue here is the control of the energy resources of the region, and that's the real reason the U.S. wants to do a deal with Iran. The Pollard deal is a codicil, a fairly minor one, to squaring Israel with what the U.S. intends to do about reestablishing Iran in its structure. Do you buy that? Do you find that fair?
Well, that's fine. Plus $2 billion.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Oh, yeah. As I say, Pollard is not even the most important part of the deal. You know. Yeah, here's a couple of $1 billion, and oh, by the way, we'll take care of that Pollard matter for you. You know, but it is a detail, and probably even a detail for the Netanyahu government too. Although it has some more public. Netanyahu is able to say now, both to Israel and to its American backers, well, look, I dealt with Jonathan Pollard, and nobody else could do that. So
Yeah.
that all looks good.
Yeah. I'm sort of, when I say that I don't look at the mainstream media at all, I'm fibbing a little bit. I get tempted every so often, and there's certain value, as
Being
Ron.
NFL.
Yeah, right. Ron, as you do, to refer to the New York Times because it's such an influential outlet.
Exactly.
But I think this one little snippet I brought in today out of curiosity wasted a couple of my 10 articles per month that I'm allowed to look at on the New York Times. But if I got,
free through the university
you know,
library.
actually, but it's on, it's only, I'm saving $8 a month for other things. But in any event, and I think this is sort of to the point in an oblique way. The news out of the New York Times is that there's going to be a new correspondent in Israel replacing Jody Roderin, who's been there for about 4 years. Peter Baker, who I've had my eye on for the last year or so, because I'm just wondering, he's obviously the golden boy of the New York Times. He's going to end up being, I predict, the next Thomas Friedman, the next foreign policy columnist. And there were some hopes on Mondoweiss, which is a website that generally endorses, at least its proprietor, Phil Weiss, endorses this theory of the Israel lobby. And along with that theory comes a certain optimism about what might change if Americans only wake up and realize that what Israel is doing isn't in the American national interest. It's a kind of fantastical view. And so the fact that Peter Baker has been assigned to go to Israel and replace Jody Ruderin is seen as perhaps an opportunity. Peter Baker, who is a non-Jew, and until then all the correspondents have been Jews. You have Ethan Bronner, and you have Isabel Kirshner, and you have Jody. I keep calling her Judy. Jody Ruderin. Okay, there's the idea that Peter Baker might be better than either of these things, either of any of these people. And he describes in a recent article that he wrote with Jody Ruderin on November 8th, he describes the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama, or the two of them describe this in the following way. Quote, they have a fraught, well, actually, they're quoting somebody else, but let's see what they're quoting here. They have a fraught relationship, and it's fueled by a belief on the part of both of them that the other is trying to screw them, trip them up, thwart their policies, corner them, ambush them, said Martin Indyk, the president's former special envoy to the Middle East. They each have a number of cases where they feel the other acted in bad faith. And I only read this to point out what a trivial understanding that the two of them are promoting and focusing on this supposed personal relationship or animosity between Obama and Netanyahu. Yes, there may be that, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is the kind of things that, Carl, you were just referring to in terms of U.S. interests in the Middle East and Israel's ongoing role in playing in finding a productive way of fitting into those interests and carrying them out. And if this is the kind of journalism that Peter Baker has done just recently, we don't have any reason whatsoever to believe that there's going to be any more revealing coverage of this when he arrives there in the next couple of months.
I mean, the force of the Israel lobby, is not to be denied. I mean, we've had two quite remarkable examples of that here in Illinois in recent months. One, of course, being the Saleta case at the University of Illinois, which, according to everybody, has been solved. It's interesting because what's happened primarily is that the U of I has been able, at some cost, to reinforce the ideological control of faculty political opinions. So in that sense, it's solved. But the Salata case and the remarkable case of SB 1761 in the Illinois legislature, with good liberal legislatures, including our local legislators. Full disclosure, David's running against one of them in the next election, so we should mention that.
Hopes to be, yes.
But these folks, these folks have voted with a bill sponsored by the Israeli consulate in Illinois, Israeli consulate in Chicago, to direct how university funds are spent or invested in ways that do not support the boycott of Israeli apartheid. This is incredible. I mean, this is an amazing story. If the same thing had been happening in regard to South African apartheid a generation ago, we would all know about it. But most people don't know about the success of the Israel lobby in the Illinois legislature and with his Illinois liberal legislators. But there are two examples, as I say, on our doorstep of the force and the importance and the effectiveness of the Israel lobby, which is all true. But as pointed out by many other people, there are a lot of other lobbies working on American politics, domestic and foreign, and many of them have far more effectiveness than the Israel lobby does. The most notable one is the defense lobby.
Yeah, well, okay. You're using the what about approach. And it's true. It's true. There are others.
The influence of the Israel lobby is not so great as that of some other lobbies.
Well, you don't know that.
The I do know that.
Okay. What about the gun lobby? The
let's talk about
the drug lobby. The drug lobby. Yeah, the military lobby.
Andrew Coburn, the Washington editor of Harper's, has just published a book called Kill Chain, an amazing piece of reportage about the electronic battlefield through the Vietnam War to the present activities of the Pentagon in such matters. The most striking thing about the book, in some ways, is the immense influence that the what we call defense companies, they're arms makers, have had over American war making, has had over America's killing people, literally for generations. Israel has nowhere near so much influence as these corporations do. As you simply describe about what they were able to accomplish, and according to Coburn's book.
I don't know how you would gauge that. By the number of lobbyists?
Number of people killed. How about that?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, the U.S. has not attacked Iran, as the Netanyahu government would like it to. The U.S. has done most of the things that the U.S. has done in regard to Israel have depended upon the fact that the U.S. uses Israel for its own purposes. The U.S. doesn't acquiesce in the repression of the Palestinians because the American government hates Palestinians. The American governments don't even notice the Palestinians. What the American government does notice is that Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and if the Israelis want to suppress the people in their, quote, their own region, close quote, we don't care.
Yeah, well, I would just raise the usual cautionary note here that Mersheimer and Walt have almost 500 pages of description, analysis, and documentation. And as far as I can see, you have only an opinion. So,
Mearsheimer and Walt have actually a very valuable book. I suggest if you read it, you read some of the comments about it, such as those by Noam Chomsky and others. But also, what Mearsheimer and Walt do is talk about the influence of the lobby, but I think don't establish the point that they do indeed argue for.
Yeah, I don't know.
Israeli interests override American interests in the activities of the American government because of the influence of that lobby. We have to talk about what Israeli interests and American interests actually are. And Israel is a cadet, is a client. It's the tail that the dog wags. It's not wagging the dog.
Well, that's your narrative, but
I think
there are others.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain. I think the question that Chomsky asks about this have asked at the time that after the book was published, is just to ask, in those cases in which American interests or what are perceived to be broader interests actually conflict with Israeli interests, or what the Israeli elite says that they want, we find examples like the Pollard case, like the Iran case, and many other cases. Israel doesn't like it particularly, or for a while at least, it didn't like it all that much when Saudi Arabia was allowed to buy sophisticated weapons. And in all those cases, a lot of them had to occurred during the first Bush administration, the HW administration in the late 80s and early 90s. In all of these cases, Israel didn't, quote unquote, get its way. And I think when we look locally, or we look at the state level at SB 1761, or we look at the Salaita case, we find these cases being examples in which the Israel lobby or people that are aligned with somehow have an affinity for Israel sort of are sending a certain message that they're still there and they can still do stuff and they can still hurt people, and that they can still generally they've been allowed to generally participate in this to enforce this idea that by and large on college campuses we don't have serious debates anymore about U.S. foreign policy. We don't have serious debates about whether we should be in the Middle East at all, and what the issues that Andrew Coburn raises in his book Kill Chain, or whether we should be fighting a drone war. These are things that we just can't talk about on college campuses. I don't know whether Salaita's visit or impending appointment here really presented a threat to these people, but to the kind of people who made their phone calls and got this sort of firestorm going. I don't know what was in their minds, but they decided to make an example of someone to enforce the point that subsequent to the Israel's operations in Gaza a year ago, last summer, that we wouldn't really be talking seriously about these things on college campuses, and we wouldn't be talking very seriously about the U.S. foreign policy that allows these things. We wouldn't be talking about whatever the academic and research and technological relationships, weapon related or otherwise, are between college campuses in this country and those in Israel, and the defense companies and weapons dealers, that we wouldn't really be talking about any of that stuff. And that's just fine with every member of the Illinois legislature to go along with using the idea that somehow, to bring in the issue of anti-Semitism, to sort of implicitly bring in the issue that all this is really about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I think all of us are properly worried about the fact that instead of the discussion that Dave was talking about, the absent discussion, we're talking about microaggression.
Yeah.
And that, whatever you want to say about things like the proper evaluation of the force of the Israel lobby in American politics, and I'm certainly not denying it has a force, I'm just denying that the force is as great as some on the right and left think. The matter should be discussed, and exactly the reason that Stephen Salaita had to be made an example of was that he presented the threat of a good example. He presented the possibility of a faculty member who actually was saying things about that, even if what he was saying was subject itself to answer and refutation. Which it may well have been, but the discussion didn't take place. That's David's point.
Yeah. Well, as a final, what about the continued building of housing in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem? Another 400 units have been announced, And there are rumblings that about the eventual annexation of the Golan Heights, which were taken from Syria, and so on. And all of which are opposed by American policy. Maybe now you're going to tell me that, well, secretly they really weren't all that opposed.
Well, look at what they've actually done. The U.S. has been saying it's opposed to this for years, and it's done nothing about it.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it is opposed to it. Doesn't want it to do that.
Well,
but it doesn't
there were some
There are more
instances
important issues.
in which George W. Bush stamped his foot and said about the continued building of housing on the West Bank. This time we really mean it.
Admitting already. I mean, George W. Bush. This is you're talking about the elder Bush, that was George H.W. Bush. Who said that.
No, I think George W. Bush might have made
W.
some
This time we really mean it.
reference to,
Well, that's because there was a history in his father's administration.
yeah, which I referred to before, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
And one of the few that actually made some moves in that direction.
Right.
So yeah.
And that, yeah.
What was H.W. Bush's political advisor who said, "Damn the Jews, they don't vote for us anyhow." And
Yeah.
they were willing, in fact, to take American policy seriously on that point for that reason.
Yeah, but it's important. There's a lot to say about the ins and outs, the daily ins and outs of these things, but look at the long-term pattern. We've never seriously opposed Israeli expansionism in the occupied territories.
You mean in the sense of attaching sanctions?
In any,
Or stopping sending them a vast
There've
amount
never
of money.
been there've never been any consequences for that. I mean, to put it in childlike terms, you know.
Exactly.
I mean, you got to have without consequences. What do you expect is going to happen? So.
Yeah.
Israel is by far the largest recipient of American monies, including military aid and so forth.
Yeah.
A serious threat to cut off some of that would get the attention of any Israeli government.
Right.
But I mean,
Granted.
One last point about Mearsheimer and Walt too. As I said, it seems to me it's quite worthwhile to read about this account from a decade ago about the influence of the Israel lobby. But we should also notice such things as Mearsheimer and Walt arguing that it was only the influence of America, of the Israel lobby and the Israel government that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Oil had nothing to do with it, says Mearsheimer and Walt. Now, they're committed to a model of international politics, the so-called realist school, where sorts of interests of that interests like that are paramount. But it seems to me that anyone who wants to argue that there was no concern for control of energy resources in the Middle East bound up with the American invasion of Iraq has at least the burden of proof on their side. And so the notion that this is the lobby and the lobby alone seems to be a little hard to take.
Yeah, it's an interesting question of is there some metric for the relative strength of various lobbies, such as the gun lobby or the military lobby or the drug lobby, which is immensely powerful and has prevented the adoption of any sane policy on drugs and medical procedures in this country for years and years.
Well, the metric, it seems like the metric would be the profits of these companies. That the richer they are, the more they're able to hire lobbyists, to influence legislators, to write the legislation themselves, more or less. Look at the TPP. I mean, we always have to come back to the general corporate interests, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, the people that are really watching out to make sure that not just at the level of a particular sector, but at a higher level, the American global economic system is in place with all of its finances and all of its relationships, and that nothing threatens that.
That's a catchy phrase, David. The executive committee of the
Yeah, I like
Write that down, David. Never noticed that. Right.
So, anyway, if you want to read a fairly short article about the relationship that I feel defines the relationship between the role of the Israel lobby And what people sometimes get wrong about that, I feel that I wrote an article that was on Palestine Chronicle a few years back, and you could easily Google that.
We'll post that on the News from Neptune site,
Yeah,
so you can find.
I think I read it recently, and I think it still holds up pretty well. I mean, there's
Okay.
no reason why it wouldn't.
Make sure that
yeah,
we
so-
have that, and I'll put that up.
Anyway, if I could just switch gears a little bit here.
Certainly.
I
A lot of
wanted
gears.
to-
A lot of gears to be switched
a
here.
lot-
I got
yeah.
several too.
Yeah, I thought I just wanted to mention Sheldon Wolin recently died,
Oh, yeah.
and we talked about him a few months ago or a year ago. Chris Hedges had done a series of interviews on the Real News Network with Sheldon Wolin, who was clearly not long for this earth, and it was good. It was good that he did those because I think they document very well the idea that Sheldon Wolin came to be associated most with in his later years is that of inverted totalitarianism as a way of defining U.S. government. And I have to admit that I didn't really, until I really went and looked this up a little bit, really know exactly what he meant by that. Was it like
I'm still puzzled. Tell me.
totalitarianism
Yeah,
from the bottom up? But
it's important.
I think Wikipedia, to its credit, defines it fairly, summarized it fairly well. They write that according to Wolin, there are three main ways in which inverted totalitarianism is the inverted form of classical totalitarianism. Whereas in Nazi Germany, the state dominated economic actors, in inverted totalitarianism, corporations, through political contributions and lobbying, dominate the United States, with the government acting as the servant of large corporations. This is considered normal, quote unquote, rather than corrupt. Second, while the Nazi regime aimed at the constant political mobilization of the populace with its Nuremberg rallies, Hitler Youth, and so on, inverted totalitarianism for the mass of the populace to be it aims for the mass of the populace to be in a persistent state of political apathy. The only type of political activity expected or desired from the citizenry is voting. Low electoral turnouts are favorably received as an indication that the bulk of the populace has given up hope and that the government will ever help them.
Well, that they're satisfied.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then third,
But we know they're not.
while the Nazis openly mocked democracy, the United States maintains the conceit that it is the model of democracy for the whole world. And then to quote one thing in this article, this Wikipedia article from Wolin himself, it is inverted totalitarianism reverses things. It is all politics all the time, but a politics largely untempered by the political. Party squabbles are occasionally on public display, as they obviously are now in the primary season. And there's a frantic and continuous politics among factions of the party, interest groups, competing corporate powers, and rival media concerns. And there is, of course, the culminating moment of national elections, when the intention of the nation is required to make a choice of personalities rather than a choice between alternatives. What is absent is the commitment to finding where the common good lies amidst the welter of well-financed, highly organized, single-minded interests, rapidly seeking governmental favors and overwhelming the practices of representative government and public administration by a sea of cash.
And are we, in fact, talking about neoliberalism when we say inverted totalitarianism? I mean, Wolin's notions here, which are formed in some sense by contrasting contemporary America, and not even in today's America, a few years ago, with Nazi Germany, were elaborated before the term neoliberalism became part of our regular political vocabulary. As it's not entirely clear to me that what Wolin is talking about is any different from what we mean by neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Maybe it is. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it may be he's talking about how neoliberalism functions in our heads at the political level, at this most banal level, to keep us constantly distracted. He's really talking about the manufacture of consent, what Chomsky and Herman call the manufacture of consent. So it's just a different way of putting it by using the word, by taking the word totalitarianism, by taking this word that was associated with Hitler and Stalin by Hannah Arendt in her famous book. He's taking it and kind of, getting us to sort of wake up and say, wait, is this what this is? Are we really that unfree?
It has it's more a Don Draper move, I think, than anything else. I'm not sure it's a successful one. What do you think, Ron?
Well, it sounds as if inverted totalitarianism is standing on its head somehow, to invoke another classical phrase. And
you're back defending Hegel again, aren't you?
Right. And I'm again not sure what it means. Neoliberalism sounds like a revival in some respects, or important or crucial respects, of liberalism in the 19th century.
Exactly.
And something like what we mean by free market capitalism.
Laissez-faire,
And that has all to be modified now by the dominance of the corporations. And so how can you fit the dominance of corporate power today in with liberalism is a difficult thing for me to figure out.
I'd be skeptical about the notion that the corporation represents a sea change in the history of capitalism. Certainly, capitalism is not a Platonic absolute that takes, it is a historical process, and in some sense we're trying to figure how important the changes in capitalism actually are, both in itself, so to speak, and also in terms of its public presentation. Because I think in some ways that's the real difference in neoliberalism, the difference between neoliberalism and 19th century laissez-faire, is that the 19th century laissez-faire said to the British government, go away. Yeah. We're perfectly happy to do what we want. We're shipping things to India and bringing things here, selling things, manufacturing things in Manchester. Just don't bother us. Yeah. The neoliberalism arises after a couple of generations in which everyone admitted that obviously the government had a role to play in controlling and coordinating the economy. And neoliberalism essentially accepts that. Yes, it says the government has a role to play. Its role is to defend the profits of the corporation. Yeah. So unlike the 19th century liberal, who says to the government, go away, the neoliberal says to the government, yeah, sure, do it. Make sure just deregulate our businesses and generate the laws which will protect our profit making around the world, globalization and what have you.
After
the TPP is the great example.
Right, subjugated the government and made it your servant.
Exactly.
Exactly. So this leads to, I think, something that I mentioned last week. So the emerging economy then is not classical liberalism,
right,
and it's not socialism. It's something somehow intermediate, a mixed economy, which keeps to stay alive, has to keep incorporating bits of socialism, and the whole thing is now sometimes called managerialism, which is neither one nor the other, but a kind of mixed bag of ideas from both camps.
I buy some version of that, and that's one of the reasons that I think this frankly rather old-fashioned notion of inverted totalitarianism may not be an advance, may not be a help. And in some of the parallels or some of the distinctions that it draws with what we're forced probably to call classic totalitarianism doesn't work. The fascism in Europe in the 20th century was a popular movement, one of the most important, a popular movement with its base in the capitalist class, with the base in the capitalist ruling class. One of the most notable posters used by the Nazis in their election campaign used by the critics of the Nazis in their election campaign was a poster of Hitler giving his peculiar form of the Nazi salute, where he put the hand backwards rather than straight forward. He was sort of receiving the salute, you see. And this was Hitler's form. That is shown in a silhouette, but in the poster, standing behind the silhouette of Hitler is a larger, shadowy figure in the shape of a businessman putting a large check into Hitler's hand. And the legend is Millionen standen hinter mir. Millions stand behind me. Which Hitler was saying about his popular support, but the millions, of course, are millions of marks, millions of dollars, money being given by the. Okay, it takes a while to get the joke across, so to speak. But it seems to me that's an important understanding of what fascism was. The second point there, I am racking my brain for the name of the German diplomat who kept one of the most detailed diaries of the Hitler years, of the years of Nazi ascendancy. And throughout the diary, he describes how anxious the rulers of Germany, the Nazi rulers of Germany, were about keeping the public happy. That it turns out they were far more concerned, had far more trouble in keeping a popular support than we did in America. And America had gone from an anti-war country to a pro-war country in a very short period of time. The Germans had more trouble maintaining that for various reasons, according to this account. I think that's probably true.
Was that Speer?
Huh?
Was that
No, it wasn't Speer. It was
Ribbentrop?
No.
Okay.
I'll post that on the Facebook page too.
Okay.
So
Well,
I'm
think-
saying is that I
yeah.
think this inverted totalitarianism, it's not incorrect, obviously, but I'm not sure it gets us much closer to where we
I would,
wanna be on that.
that's perhaps why I've had a little trouble grasping it and wanting to get a little deeper into it. And I think some good points are made in contrast, but it doesn't. I don't know if it necessarily is the best. You're right. I don't know if it's necessarily the best way to really define or explain the kind of system we really do have. It provides a framework for making some good points about how it is we manage to continue to believe that we live in a democratic society when we no longer do.
To continue the contrarian theme of News from Neptune today, I want to turn to a piece from Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford writes for Black Agenda Report, a very interesting collection of news commentaries that are for broadcast and articles. He is regularly, I think, one of the most important commentators on the issues that we raised at the very beginning of the hour, particularly these concerned on college campuses about racism and the proper response. Here is what Glenn Ford has to say. If the Democratic Party is where grassroots movement go to die, then the run-up to presidential elections is a year-long procession of dead activists walking. That's his version of the sheepdog account of what's going on amongst Democratic liberals. That also comes, by the way, the original article comes from Black Agenda Report. This week, the funders of the Democratic wing of the corporate deep state, most prominently currency manipulator George Soros, have invited the good, the bad, and the hungry elements of what is widely called the Black Lives Matter movement to make their case for cash infusions. The Democracies Alliance stated mission, this is Soros's group, is, quote, to build progressive infrastructure that could help counter the well-funded and sophisticated conservative apparatus in the areas of civic engagement, leadership, media, and ideas, quote, close quote. Translation, to transform leftish activist organizations into loyal, dependent annexes of the Democratic Party. And this, by the way, while Hillary Clinton is busily moving strongly to the right, even noted by some liberal commentators this week. Now, this article, and I'll post this one too to our Facebook page, goes on to describe in which the ways in which the various Black Lives Matters movements, and there are a couple, are being incorporated into the Democratic Party and specifically into the Clinton campaign by principal funders of the Democratic Party. This is not a good thing, capital G, capital T, and it seems to me to raise very serious questions about some of the sort of identity politics forms of contemporary anti-racist movements. It's an important article. Comments, gentlemen?
Glenn Ford is always reliable for speaking, almost always reliable for speaking honestly and truthfully, which befits, a black man who opposes so much of the pieties of the sort of post-civil rights movement. And I am always glad that he and Bruce Dixon are there at Black Agenda Report doing what they do. I rely on them as much as almost anyone to speak truthfully, not that I don't listen critically. Ford also did a good riposte to the events in Paris by reminding us of, in one of his commentaries on the Real News Network, about the history of French colonization and decolonization of Algeria, particularly referring to the events of 1961 and 62, reminding us how many people, how many Algerians France killed before it decided that it could no longer rule that country.
Yeah, I've read a little bit of them, but I guess I've been put off from time to time by the prevalence of lurid adjectives and adverbs.
Something we would never do, right?
Right.
Oh, by the way, here are your handcuffs. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 47th week of 2015, an All Governments Lie edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zook. Our thanks to our directors and producers, Jason and Yusuf. Upcoming events here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. See our Facebook page for News from Neptune, and also the blog News from Neptune is up and running these days. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.